So I don't know why I was thinking about this week, but pretty much I think the aviation industry is wrongly maligned in a way, at least when it comes to climate change. And they're not really wrongly maligned. I'm using that right now, but it's more that I think that focusing on the aviation industry in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's fine and it should be done to a certain extent, but it's important to put it into context. And that's because the global aviation industry is responsible for 2.5% of CO2 emissions. So even a little bit less than 2.5%. However, if you include other pollutants that they put out, I read somewhere that you can say that it's responsible for up to 5% when it comes to, they wrote, the world climate warming problem. But that's looking at other ways that it warms the planet, I guess maybe in short term. And these things could equally stand true for a bunch of other sectors. So I think it's important to just stick to
Yeah.
CO2 emissions now.
Do you know if that includes, maybe that includes the production as well, the, the
No, I don't think
cost?
making, I don't know. I don't think that's what they meant. But anyway, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, they're responsible for 2.5% globally. In the US, for instance, they're responsible for apparently only 12% of transportation emissions, and they account for 3% of the nation's total greenhouse gas emissions. And compared to cars, which are road transport is responsible for 74% of transportation emissions in the US. So I think that when you look at these numbers, 2.5% globally, really putting a lot of focus, and there are many people who put a lot of focus on the aviation industry, it's kind of a waste of time. I don't disagree that, hey, you should be trying to limit as much as possible. Do not do wasteful traveling for no reason. But let's say you cut that 2.5 in half. Okay, so then you're talking about 1.2. And then if you keep on focusing on chipping away at this industry's and greenhouse gas emissions, you're not going to go far. You know, you're barely going to make a dent when you look at how much the other sectors are responsible. And here another couple of other figures that I think further back that point. For instance, 80% of aviation emissions are emitted from flights of over 1,500 kilometers. So there aren't really any other practical alternative options for such trips that you can turn to. Airplanes carried 4.3 billion passengers in 2018, but I really wanted to see how many unique passengers there were. So how many people traveled at least once a year? Because of course, we know that a lot of people are serial travelers where some people travel once or twice. So that'll be interesting to see at the proportion of how much certain groups of people are responsible for the aviation industry's emissions. By 2050, they're hoping that net aviation carbon emissions will be half of what they were in 2005. And they're also trying to cut down to improve fuel efficiency by around 1.5% per year. So, I mean, these are kind of modest targets, but I think they are fair targets. They're achievable targets. And anything beyond that, I don't see it being so feasible. I mean, airplanes, the aviation industry plays a big role in the world. For instance, when it comes to transporting goods, air transport carries only about 0.5% of world trade shipment, but that accounts for 35% of its value. So it kind of points out to such specific cherishable goods and other high value goods that can kind of only be transported by the aviation industry. So really this makes me think that, you know, the aviation industry, in a way, when it comes to climate change, it is wrongly maligned. And no matter how much you focus on this industry, I think there's only so much that can be done realistically. And then you look at all the other sectors, focusing on the other sectors. I mean, to be completely transparent here, I'm vegan myself, and I know that. So I think that when it comes to food, and even not even just switching to non-animal based products, which in general use less water, and for instance, when it comes to cows, they don't have methane emissions associated with them, but also a lot of food is wasted. A third of the world's food is wasted. And then the energy sector, of course, accounts for the bulk of CO2 emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions, around 40%. So targeting the energy sector will be so much more fruitful. You know, if somehow people cut down the amount of, let's say, residential emissions, somehow like people's daily lives by half, that would make such a bigger dent than even if you cut the aviation industry by a lot more.
Hot take for sure, because I do think, generally speaking, every industry is the one that is the most, at least in the mainstream media, is the one that you hear the most being attacked by the public and sometimes government. Like there was a massive issue in the UK over the third runway for Heathrow, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, I generally speaking, I agree with you. And for a long time, I always thought that, first of all, cars and that type of thing are much, they play a much bigger role in polluting the environment, and they have a bigger impact on environment in terms of like you have to create roads and tunnels and stuff relative, like trains, they need to be built. Relatively speaking, an airport does not have as much effect, and the distance it covers. For example, if you want to go from China to Europe, it's much faster with airplane than car. Like it, there is definitely a relative advantage to using it, you know. So I do think, like, it seemed to me always the focus should be on other industries. I do disagree with you that like, if there is political will, they can reduce, like, I don't believe the goals they set for themselves are realistic goals, because they're just if there was political will, they could do probably much more. Like if they invested in newer technologies as much as they invest in drilling in the sea for gas or whatever. That's one thing. And just generally, I don't know if you watched the documentary produced by Michael Moore, Planet of the Humans. I think that's a fantastic documentary. I highly suggest to everyone to watch that, because I just generally, that's my general view, that I think the environmental issue is largely in, this is my view, this is not the view endorsed in the documentary, but it's just the population issue. It's just, you know, when it's an overpopulation issue, if we want to maintain a certain quality of life, otherwise we either should accept complete destruction of the environment, or and, to be honest, and reduction of our standards of living. Otherwise, I see majority of all other things as just much ado about nothing, really. Just, you know, media talk, bullshit talk, fill in the pages for something. But very interesting. I'll be interested to see if there are any arguments against, like maybe there is some issues we are not aware of in terms of, I wonder what's the production cost of airplanes and that type of thing.
Yeah, but okay, well, coming back to the population thing, we had this argument last week, and you know, I totally don't think that environmental and climate change issues are a population issue. As I mentioned last week, if we get rid of half of the world's population, if you don't get rid of the right half who are immense,
Thanos.
who are consuming a lot more energy and goods than others, you would barely make a dent. And also, planet's population isn't going to be going, the projections aren't always on the rise. It's supposed to be leveling and going down. So that in a way is being taken care of itself. And as long as there aren't lifestyle and policy changes that happen, the population part wouldn't make much a difference. Let's say if humans start consuming 5 times more, and you get rid of even 80% of the world's population, you could be using more resources and emitting more greenhouse gas emissions.
No, wait. As I mentioned last week, though, I think there are structural issues. First of all, population is supposed to balance itself out around 10 billion. So it's gonna go up and then it's gonna come down again, but it's not gonna go lower than what it is now. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think if you have a lower population, then you can have a more effective education system. Then you can control consumption. Then you can actually control the way, maybe even in a slower phase, you can get back the same level of population. But I don't think this fast of a population growth in such a short time, with lack of education and lack of core infrastructure, naturally leads to overconsumption, naturally leads to chaos, leading to war, leading to blah blah, leads to issues that doesn't allow for dealing with climate, because at the moment there is such a large population that needs energy all the time. So yeah, but yeah, I completely see your points as well though. So but it's good that we found a bit of an overlap in the airplane industry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can have, 100 billion people living on the planet. Maybe that will be one too many, or maybe even 20 billion. I think just the population itself, if we don't change other things, it might not make a dent at
Sure.
all. And there are so many examples of different countries where with smaller population, they're not able to achieve the same level of education than a country with a much larger part of population. So I think it's one factor, but it can be overshadowed by other factors easily.
Definitely. Yeah.
But yeah, that's the
And I'm looking.
and I have a funny
Yeah.
story about this, about just how ridiculous it is. This was from like 3 to 4 years ago. I was watching Democracy Now, and there was a scientist. It was around the CUP time, so the conference on climate change, whatever, the yearly thing. And he was talking about the aviation industry and everything and changing our habits. And he's like, for instance, I had to go, it's a true story, I swear. He's like, I had to go to a conference. He was a British man, or American, I believe, British. I had to go to a conference in China, and I took the train. He's like, hey, it took me 2 weeks, but I wrote 2 papers, so I made the most of it. I mean, first, that sounds awesome. I don't like taking the plane. And if I was also able to go on a train and focus like that on working, I think that's a good idea. So personally, for me, it would work, and I don't even like boarding the plane. I'd rather take the train most places. So I'm not even like that much into airplanes or love traveling or fly every
Oh,
weekend. But it just shows how ridiculous that suggestion was. I mean, it was one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. And at that time, I was thinking, okay, if it's responsible for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions or something astronomical, maybe then you have to make insane, ridiculous changes. But at 2.5%, hey, kudos to activists putting some pressure. So hopefully, the airline industry is supposed to triple the number of people that will be carrying by 2050. So, I mean, it's good that there's this kind of pressure, but no matter how much pressure there is, there's only so far that it can go. So the main focus shouldn't be there.